The truck's engine stopped roaring, plunging the surroundings into an almost unreal silence. The headlights briefly illuminated the dirt path ahead before shutting off, leaving the forest shrouded in shadows. The man, a paranormal investigator with years of experience, sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring intently at the trees.
"All right, it's now or never,"
he muttered, closing his eyes for a second to focus before opening the door. The cold night air greeted him immediately, carrying the earthy, damp scent of a forest that seemed more alive than the rest of the world. He reached for his backpack in the back seat, meticulously checking his gear, camera, audio recorder, EMF detector. Everything was in place, ready to document whatever he might encounter in this place. With a soft click, he turned on his flashlight and surveyed the path ahead. To his right, the shadows of the trees stretched out like tangled arms. To his left, the ground sloped gently down into a dark hollow.
"Nothing different from other sites,"
he told himself, though deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Ever since he'd arrived in the area, something inside him whispered that this forest was different. As he moved forward, the sound of his footsteps crunching on dry leaves and snapping twigs echoed uncomfortably loud. The silence of the forest wasn't natural. There were no crickets, no nocturnal birds, not even the distant hoot of an owl. It was a total void. He paused for a moment to listen, holding his flashlight high. The beam swept between the towering trunks, catching glimpses of the mist that wove its way through the trees. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched clung to him like a second skin. A noise. Faint, like a whisper among the branches. He turned his head sharply, shining the flashlight toward the source of the sound. Nothing. Only fallen leaves and a leaning tree that looked older than time itself.
"Probably just branches falling,"
he murmured, though his tone lacked enough confidence to convince even himself. He kept walking, venturing deeper into the darkness. Every now and then, he glanced back to make sure the truck was still visible. But the path began to curve, and soon, the faint glow of the headlights disappeared entirely. Another noise made him stop dead in his tracks. This time, it wasn't the crack of a branch but a distant, dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. The direction was clear, ahead, deeper into the forest. He stood still, muscles tensed, waiting. But the silence returned as swiftly as it had been broken. Swallowing hard, he looked at the EMF detector in his hand. The device remained off, inert, as if whatever had caused the sound was beyond its ability to detect.
"Okay, stay calm,"
he told himself, adjusting the strap of his backpack.
"There's still nothing, just noise."
He moved forward again, but his pace was slower now. The air felt heavier, colder. And although nothing was visible among the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. The path seemed endless. Every step crunched beneath his boots, a sound that pierced the eerie silence surrounding him. The flashlight beam swept over the trees, but everything looked the same: tall trunks, gnarled roots, and endless shadows shifting as he moved forward. Around him, the monotony of the landscape began to play tricks on his mind. Each tree looked identical to the last, and the darkness made it impossible to tell if he was truly moving forward or simply wandering in circles.
"Every damn tree looks the same,"
he muttered, shaking his head in an attempt to clear the creeping sense of disorientation. The air felt heavier, as if the forest were tightening its branches around him. The constant sensation of being watched gnawed at him, and though his EMF detector remained silent, the paranoia refused to loosen its grip. Then something caught his attention. The ground ahead looked different. He lowered the flashlight, directing its beam forward, and noticed that the dry leaves and broken branches carpeting the forest floor gave way to a cleared area. Quickening his pace, he tried to ignore the chill running down his spine. When he reached the clearing, he froze. Before him, the trees had been knocked down, as if something had ripped them from their roots. At least a dozen trunks lay scattered, their forms broken in irregular ways. Some were split clean in half, while others had their roots exposed and clawing at the air. His flashlight illuminated the scene, and what he saw left him stunned.
What the hell happened here?
He stepped closer to one of the fallen trunks, examining it carefully. The markings on the wood didn't look natural. They weren't clean cuts like those made by an axe, nor were they the signs of a tree felled by a storm. The splinters looked torn, as though something massive had ripped them apart with brute force. The ground bore marks as well. Deep grooves crisscrossed the soil, as though something had dragged the trees aside. He crouched to inspect one of the grooves, running his fingers over the wood. Long, deep claw marks scored its surface.
This wasn't done by any ordinary animal.
The air felt colder here, and the silence was even more oppressive. Even the sound of his own movements seemed muted, as if the forest were swallowing every noise. He switched on his audio recorder and began to speak, more to document what he was seeing than to calm his nerves.
I've found a clearing with fallen trees. It doesn't look like the work of a storm or machinery. There are claw marks on the trunks and the ground. Whatever did this had to be massive.
He stood and stepped toward the center of the clearing, shining his light in all directions. The place felt strange, as though the forest had deliberately pulled back to create this space. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and his heart skipped a beat.
Don't do this to me now.
He growled, tapping the flashlight's metal casing lightly. The light steadied, but that brief flicker was enough to make his breath quicken. As he approached another fallen tree, something stopped him. A sound. It wasn't a creak or a thud but a low, constant hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. He froze, listening. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Lowering the flashlight, he strained to pinpoint its source. The hum wasn't natural, and the worst part was that he couldn't tell where it was coming from.
What the hell is that?
He whispered, as though speaking louder might summon whatever was behind it. Suddenly, the sound stopped, cutting off as abruptly as it had begun. The silence returned, but it was different this time. Denser. More suffocating. It pressed down on him like an invisible weight, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was closing in from the shadows. He spun around, sweeping the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing to see. Just fallen trees, torn up ground, and the endless shadows of the forest. And then he felt it again, that presence. It was there, watching him. But still, he couldn't see it. The hum pulled him deeper and deeper into the forest. He had lost track of time, and when he checked his watch, he realized he had been walking for hours. The thought of being so far from his truck sent a knot twisting in his stomach. He stopped, torn.
Turn back or keep going.
He murmured, weighing his options. But the hum was stronger now, almost tangible, as if something beyond the trees was calling out to him.
A little farther. Just a little farther.
Resolute, he tightened the strap on his backpack and pressed on. The deeper he ventured, the stranger his surroundings became. The trees grew more twisted, their branches stretching out like deformed fingers, as if they were trying to grasp him. The darkness thickened, and his flashlight struggled to pierce it. Suddenly, between the trees, he saw something. A faint yet vibrant light pulsing gently, almost as if it were alive. He froze, watching it from a distance. The light seemed to float, hypnotic, and though every instinct screamed at him to turn back, his feet began moving toward it on their own. The hum grew deafening as he reached the edge of the clearing. This one was smaller than the last, but what he saw at its center left him speechless. Floating in the air was an impossible creature. Its main body was a slender, elongated prism, and around it stretched massive structures resembling wings. Yet they weren't wings in the traditional sense, they shimmered like liquid crystal, reflecting light in intricate patterns that danced across the fallen trees and the ground. With trembling hands, the investigator raised his camera and pointed it toward the creature. Through the lens, the details became even sharper. The wings seemed to shift constantly, their texture and form changing with every pulse of light.
This is incredible,
he whispered, momentarily forgetting the fear that had gripped him. He took a cautious step closer, trying to frame a better shot. But as he moved, his EMF detector sprang to life. At first, it emitted a low beep, but it quickly escalated into a sharp, frantic screech. He froze, staring at the device as if it might offer an explanation.
What the hell?
The creature's hum shifted abruptly, intensifying into a pulsing vibration that made the air around him feel electric. Before he could react, a powerful gust of wind erupted from the prism, shoving him backward.
Damn it!
He shouted, struggling to stay on his feet. A second blast hit him, harder this time, knocking him flat on his back. The cold, damp ground greeted him with a force that left him breathless. It took a few seconds to recover, and when he finally scrambled to his feet, he aimed his camera back at the prism. What he saw left him rooted to the spot. The creature's wings, which had previously encased it like a cocoon, were trembling and slowly beginning to open. Each movement was deliberate, like it was awakening from a long slumber.
What are you?
He murmured, the camera shaking in his hands. When the wings were halfway open, they paused. The clearing fell deathly silent, as though the entire world had stopped to watch. And then, in one swift, violent motion, the wings fully unfolded. The impact was catastrophic. A wave of air struck him with such force that he was thrown to the ground again, while a blinding flash of light erupted from the creature. The camera in his hands emitted a loud crackle and began to spark before dying entirely, its circuits fried by the overwhelming brilliance. Barely able to see, he felt an intense heat near his face. A sharp sound, like a blade slicing through the air, made him instinctively turn his head. When his vision cleared, he saw the wings, now fully extended, slicing through the forest like enormous blades. Every tree they touched fell with a deafening crash, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. Branches splintered, trunks split, and the ground shook under the force of the chaos. The investigator was frozen, his heart pounding like a drum. He couldn't move, couldn't think. He could only watch as the prism hovered in place, its light pulsing with an intensity that felt like it could tear the very air apart.